What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Sleep paralysis. The visitor has been documented since 400 BC. She woke at 3:12 a.m. and could not move. The figure standing in the corner of her bedroom had been there before. She knew it the way you know a recurring nightmare. But this time it turned its head. It had no face. It had never had a face, and it was closer than it had ever been. To understand how we arrived at this moment, and why this moment has been arriving for human beings since at least 400 BC, we need to go back to the beginning. There is a threshold that exists between sleeping and waking, a corridor through which every human being passes twice each day, and it is not, as most have assumed, empty. Consider the scale of what we are actually discussing before you permit yourself the comfortable delusion that this is a story about brain chemistry and misfiring neurons. Consider that human beings have been cataloging the same experience, the same paralysis, the same pressure, the same figure emerging from the same corner of the same darkness, across every civilization, every continent, every century for which written records survive. Consider that Greek physicians documented it formally in 400 BC, that Mesopotamian tablets describe it in 2500 BC, that cave paintings in sites across the Iberian Peninsula, predating written language by millennia, depict the prone human figure with a dark mass upon the chest in arrangements that require no translation. This is not a modern phenomenon. It is not a product of stress or screen exposure or the anxieties of contemporary life. It is something that has attended human sleep since before the concept of sleep was understood. Something that waited in the dark angles of ancient caves while our ancestors' brains were still learning to process the difference between symbol and reality. Something that learned the precise geometry of our paralysis before we had language to describe what paralysis was. Dr. Callum Yates, Sleep Pathology Research Unit, University of Edinburgh, 2019. What strikes me about the cross-cultural consistency is not the experience itself. Hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations are well-documented neurological events. What strikes me is the entity, the specific entity. No amount of neurological explanation accounts for the fact that a woman in Lagos and a farmer in rural Hokkaido and a teenager in rural Saskatchewan describe, independently and without access to each other's accounts, the same face. The same face. Across every language, every culture, every era, the same face has been looking down at the paralyzed human form since before the first city was built, before the first god was named, before the first prayer was ever offered upward by trembling hands in darkness. What is it? Where does it come from? What does it want? Those are questions that presume the entity in question exists within a framework of motivation and origin that human cognition can process. They are, in their fundamental architecture, the wrong questions. The right question, the one that has cost researchers and scholars and witnesses their sleep, their sanity, and in several documented cases their willingness to continue living, is this: why does it keep coming back? The answer to that question does not comfort. The answer to that question is older than comfort. The answer is older than human consciousness itself, and it has been there, in the corner of your room, on certain specific nights, waiting patiently for your eyes to open and find it. It has always been waiting. It is, by every available measure, very patient indeed. Tonight, we will go places inside this subject that the clinical literature declines to follow. Tonight, we will look at everything that science explains, and then we will stand very carefully at the edge of everything it does not. He told himself it was nothing. The universe had been telling him the same thing for 32 years. The universe, it turned out, was not reliable. Let me tell you about a man named Daniel Abraham, because Daniel is as good a place to start as any, and because Daniel is, in almost every meaningful way, you. Daniel was 34 years old, lived in a two-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, worked as a junior account manager at an insurance firm, and had been in a relationship with a woman named Priya for 3 years that was going well but not perfectly, which is to say it was going the way most real relationships go for most real people. He liked the Bengals. He owned a second-hand couch that he kept meaning to replace. He had a crack in the ceiling above his bed, a diagonal one, running from the smoke detector toward the window, that he'd been meaning to have looked at since March. He had been meaning to do a lot of things since March. That's life at 34 in a second-floor Columbus apartment. You're always about to get around to things. Daniel slept, when work wasn't too heavy, about 6.5 hours a night. He fell asleep within minutes of lying down. He had that gift, that particular grace, and he woke to his alarm at 6:47 every morning feeling like a man who had been assembled in the night from parts that didn't quite fit together. He would describe himself as a light sleeper. He would be wrong about that in ways that would become relevant. He was not, by any reasonable measure, the kind of person horror happens to. He was the kind of person horror passes over. The ordinary man in the ordinary apartment with the ordinary life. The kind of life that serves as background in other people's stories. He first noticed something wrong the previous November. He wasn't even sure he'd call it wrong, more like unusual. He'd woken at around 3 a.m., which wasn't like him, and for a few seconds he'd been unable to move. Completely unable. Arms, legs, neck, nothing responding. He'd lain there in his darkness, blinking at the ceiling crack, feeling a pressure he couldn't immediately locate pressing down on him from the chest. Priya was asleep beside him. The apartment was its regular nighttime self, the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of traffic on 5th Street, the faint orange city glow around the edges of the curtains. Nothing wrong, nothing out of place. Just the feeling of something very wrong. He told himself it was a muscle thing, a weird sleep thing. He'd heard about this, read about it once on Reddit maybe, or WebMD. Your muscles lock up sometimes when you're half awake. It happens. It's the body doing something boring and biological and completely, perfectly explainable. He went back to sleep within minutes. He told Priya the next morning over coffee, laughing a little. She said that it happened to her once in college and it was terrifying. They moved on. He ate his toast. He went to work. He had a normal day. That was November 7th. He would not have a fully normal day again for a very long time after that. You need to know a few things about Daniel before we go further. Because the kind of person he was matters to what happened to him. And because, and this is the thing about sleep paralysis that nobody in the clinical literature wants to say out loud, what you are affects how it finds you. Daniel's mother had been a worrier, a real, deep-rooted worrier in the way that some people from certain specific kinds of families become worriers, the kind who checked the locks twice before bed and kept a mental catalog of everything that could go wrong and probably would. She'd passed some of that to Daniel, diluted, the way genetic traits get diluted. He wasn't anxious the way she was. But he was the kind of man who, when things were going well, spent a certain quiet portion of his mental energy waiting for the other shoe to drop. He'd had some rough patches. His 20s had included a period of about 8 months where he'd been in a dark place he didn't talk about much, not depression exactly, or not officially, but a heaviness that had sat on him like a physical weight and made even the simple machinery of daily life feel like something he was pushing through instead of living. He'd come out the other side of it. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't do drugs. He went to the gym twice a week with varying levels of commitment and made real pasta on Sundays, which was a ritual from his Italian grandmother that he clung to with the unexamined ferocity of a man who doesn't realize which things are actually holding him together. Priya knew about the dark patch. She knew he sometimes woke at night and lay staring at nothing for 20 minutes before dropping back off. She knew he had a tendency to catastrophize quietly, internally, without showing it. She loved him anyway, probably because of it, honestly. He had, as a child, been prone to nightmares. Not the falling kind or the chased kind, the bad kind. The kind where the dream has no action, no narrative, just a quality of wrongness that saturates everything, and that you carry into the morning and sometimes into the afternoon. He'd grown out of most of them. The last bad one he could remember was from his early 20s, during the dark patch, a dream about a room with a door that kept getting further away. The second time it happened was November 14th, 1 week after the first time, almost to the hour. He woke at 3:09 a.m. He couldn't move. The pressure was back on his chest, more defined now, more directional, as though something with actual weight was sitting there. He lay still, breathing, telling himself the same thing he'd told himself the week before. Biological, normal, read it documented, perfectly explainable. He was looking at the ceiling crack. And then, without meaning to, without deciding to, his eyes moved to the corner of the room. He told Priya in the morning that he thought he needed more sleep. He didn't tell her what he'd seen. He didn't have the words for it yet. He wasn't sure the words existed. Here is the thing about human beings and the darkness in the corner of a room. We are very, very good at explaining it away. Daniel did not see a figure on November 14th. He saw a shape, a quality of dark that was slightly denser than the surrounding dark, roughly humanoid in the way that shadows thrown by a street lamp through a curtained window can occasionally approximate humanoid shapes if you're half asleep and scared. He was a rational man. He was 34 years old and had a degree in business administration from Ohio State, and paid his taxes on time and believed, broadly, in the scientific method and the explanatory power of reason. He was not going to lie in his bed in Columbus, Ohio, and tell himself he had seen something supernatural standing in the corner of his room. He told himself he'd been half asleep. His brain had been in that weird liminal zone between sleep and waking. He remembered reading about this somewhere, about how the brain could produce visual artifacts during that transition, just the visual cortex doing its nightly housekeeping at a slightly inconvenient time. Nothing more than that. A trick of a tired brain. The shape had been his bathrobe. He'd hung his bathrobe on the back of the closet door, and in the dark it could absolutely look like a standing figure if you were in the right state of mind, which is to say the wrong state of mind, which is to say half asleep and already primed by the previous week's weirdness to see things that weren't there. He moved the bathrobe to the bathroom. November 21st, 3:08 a.m. The paralysis again, the pressure, heavier this time. He lay absolutely still with his eyes fixed on the ceiling crack and did not look at the corner, and after what felt like 5 minutes but was probably 90 seconds, everything released and he could move, and he turned on the bedside lamp and the corner was empty, and he sat up and breathed and thought, there. See, nothing there. You knew it would be nothing. He did not sleep again that night. He Googled sleep paralysis the next morning over coffee alone, because Priya had an early shift and the apartment was quiet. He read about REM atonia, the mechanism that keeps you from physically acting out your dreams, occasionally persisting into the waking state. He read about hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, the brain generating sensory experiences during the sleep-wake transition. He read about the chest pressure sensation, which apparently had a physiological explanation involving breathing and diaphragm function. He read that it was extremely common, that it was nothing to worry about. That stress was a primary trigger. He was comforted by all of this for almost exactly 12 hours. Because the rationalization, as airtight as it seemed in the morning sun, had a problem. A small one. The kind of small problem that you try very hard not to think about because thinking about it is like pushing your tongue into a loose tooth. Unpleasant, compulsive, and impossible to stop once you start. The problem was that whatever he had seen in the corner of his room on November 14th in that dense patch of dark. It had been standing in the exact same spot his bathrobe had been hanging. Not approximately, exactly. And his bathrobe had been there every night since he moved in 2 years ago, and he had never seen a shape before. There is a particular kind of decision that people make in horror stories that the people outside the horror story can never understand. The decision to stay. The decision not to call someone, not to leave, not to disrupt a life that is otherwise functioning perfectly because of something that may be nothing, something that probably is nothing, something that science has already explained in a way that should be satisfying and somehow isn't. Daniel did not move. Daniel did not tell Priya the whole truth. Daniel did not, in any meaningful sense, do any of the sensible things. What Daniel did was leave a lamp on. He bought a small nightlight from CVS, the kind shaped like a star that plugged into the socket near the bathroom, and he put it in. He told Priya it was because he kept bumping into things on the way to the bathroom at night. She gave him a look that said she didn't entirely believe him, and also that she was going to give him the space to come to her when he was ready, which is the kind of look that makes you love someone and feel guilty simultaneously. December came. He hadn't had another episode since the 21st, and the part of him that was very good at explaining things away began to wonder if the whole run of it was over. People had bad stretches of sleep. He'd been stressed about a particular account at work. Stress messes with sleep. Sleep messes with the brain. The brain, briefly messed with, generates visual weirdness. It was over. Then it was December 9th and 3:11 a.m., and he woke up and could not move, and the nightlight was off. The nightlight he had plugged into a charged socket, the nightlight that had been burning every night for the past 2.5 weeks, was dark. And in the corner where the bathrobe used to hang, where the shape had been, something was standing. And this time it was not a shape. It was not a quality of dark. It was not a trick of a tired brain. It was close enough to the bed that he could hear it breathing. He lay there, every muscle locked, the pressure on his chest like a hand, no, like two hands, steady and patient. He wanted to scream. He could not. He wanted to turn his head away. He could not. He lay there and looked at it, or more precisely, he lay there and felt it looking back at him with whatever it used to look. It lasted 43 seconds. He counted. Then it was gone. The nightlight came back on. His body was his own again. He sat up in bed, shaking in a way he couldn't control, and thought with absolute clarity, I have to understand what this is. He had no idea what he was walking toward. And here is the part nobody talks about, the part left out of every news report, every official account, every interview, because the people who knew, the ones who were actually there, made a decision. They decided some things were better left unsaid. They were wrong. And tonight, you're going to hear why. He told himself it was over. The house had been listening to him say that for 3 weeks. Houses do not forget what they hear. The nightlight did not come back on the following night. Daniel checked the socket. He checked the bulb. He replaced the bulb with a new one from the kitchen drawer. He plugged it back in. It worked. He went to bed with the light burning and woke in the morning with it still burning. He did this for 4 nights and everything was fine. Priya said he seemed tired. He said he was fine. The apartment was as it always was. The closet door was open on the 5th night. He was certain he had closed it. He always closed it. He had a specific memory of closing it, reaching out, hearing the click. He stood in the bedroom doorway in the dark, looking at the open closet door for a moment. Then he closed it and went to bed. In the morning, the curtain on the left window was unhooked from its rod, just the left one. He didn't mention it to Priya. 3 days before Christmas, she asked him if he was sleeping. He said mostly. She looked at him in the way that meant she was deciding whether to push. She did not push. She put her hand on his arm for a moment. She went to make tea. He stood alone in the kitchen while she was in the next room and looked at the table, at the 2 chairs. At the second chair. He had not moved it. It was not in an unusual position, but it was turned very slightly away from the table, just a few degrees. as though someone had been sitting in it and hadn't quite pushed it back in properly. He lived alone before Priya. For 4 years he lived in this apartment alone. He knew how he left things. He knew how things sat when only he touched them. He pushed the chair back in and did not say anything. That night he woke at 3:11 and could not move, and the nightlight was dark again, and the closet door was open again, and the figure was standing not in the corner but at the foot of the bed. He lay there, he breathed, he counted seconds. The figure did not move. After 61 seconds he could move again, and the nightlight came back on, and the figure was gone, and the closet door was still open. He closed the closet door. He did not sleep again. He sat up until Priya's alarm went off at 7 a.m., and he listened to her get ready, and he thought about telling her everything, and he did not. The chair was turned again at breakfast. He pushed it back in without comment. Priya found the notebook on December 28th. He'd started keeping it after the December 9th episode, a small blue moleskine from the office supply cabinet. Nothing fancy, in which he'd been writing down the times, the durations, the details of each episode. Date, time, duration, what he'd seen, where in the room, how close. He'd been clinical about it, methodical. He was in insurance. He believed in documentation. She didn't read it. She held it up and said, "What is this?" And he said it was nothing, just something he was keeping track of, sleep stuff, nothing serious. And she sat down at the kitchen table. She pushed that chair in without noticing, automatically, the way you develop small habits in shared spaces, and she said, "Daniel, tell me." So he told her. He told her about November 7th and November 14th and November 21st and December 9th. He told her about the nightlight. He told her about the bathrobe. He told her what he'd seen on December 9th, and he watched her face very carefully while he told her, looking for the exact moment when she stopped fully believing him, because he knew it would come and he needed to know when it happened. It came around the close enough to hear it breathing part. She didn't disbelieve him exactly. She loved him. She was careful with him. She said, "That sounds terrifying. And have you talked to a doctor? And sleep paralysis is a real thing. It can be genuinely scary, and maybe we could try." And he nodded and said yes, and agreed that a doctor was a good idea, and listened to her practical suggestions, and felt, for the first time, the specific loneliness of knowing that the person who loves you most in the world is hearing a completely different story than the one you are telling. She changed the subject eventually. He let her. They watched something on TV, something light, and she fell asleep on the couch with her head on his shoulder, and he sat very still so as not to wake her and stared at the blank wall above the television. The apartment was quiet. He could feel the bedroom behind him. He did not turn around. He had the very specific thought that it was already in there, in the dark of the bedroom, waiting with the patience of something that has been waiting since before patience was a concept. And then he had a worse thought, that it was not in the bedroom, that it had come out, that it was standing directly behind him, on the other side of the couch, and that the reason Priya hadn't woken was not because he was sitting still. He did not turn around. What you just heard was only the beginning. He turned around eventually. There was nothing there. He went to bed. He slept even for a few hours. This is important to understand about sleep paralysis. The horror is not that you never sleep again. The horror is that you always sleep again. You have to. The body demands it. And the body, in demanding sleep, brings you back every night to the same place, the same dark, the same threshold. The notebook filled up by January 15th. He started a second one. Priya moved through the apartment the way she always moved through it, efficiently, cheerfully, with her particular grace. She had stopped asking him about the sleep thing, not because she didn't care, because he had said it's getting better 3 times in 2 weeks, and she had decided to believe him, which is what people do when they love someone and the alternative is too frightening to sit with. He ate breakfast. He went to work. He came home. He made pasta on Sunday. He was present for all of it. He was also simultaneously not present at all. There was a quality to the apartment now that he couldn't name and didn't try to. The best he could do was this. The apartment was the same. Everything was exactly in its correct place. And yet every room felt like a room that had recently been left by someone who was just outside the door. His colleague Marcus asked him if everything was all right. He said yes. His doctor, he did go, to his credit to his doctor, said his blood work was normal. His blood pressure was slightly elevated but within acceptable range. Sleep paralysis was very common. Stress was a significant trigger. He should try cutting back on caffeine and establishing a consistent sleep schedule. He drove home from the appointment and sat in the parking garage for 8 minutes before going inside. January 22nd. He woke at 3:11. He could not move. The nightlight was on, which was new. The figure was standing at the bedroom door, which was new. It was between him and the hallway. It was between him and Priya, who was asleep beside him. It was facing her. He could not move. He could not make a sound. He lay there and watched it watch her for 67 seconds. Then it turned and looked at him. And he understood, in a way he could not articulate then and cannot fully articulate now, that this was not an accident, that it had always known he was there, that showing him, letting him watch it watch her, had been deliberate. It was communicating something. He didn't know what. He didn't want to know. She noticed it on a Tuesday. 3 days later, it had a name in a police report, but the name was 3,000 years old. January 1999, Northampton General Hospital, England. Dr. Julia Sanchez, neurological researcher, began the first formal British study of sleep paralysis phenomenology on January 14, 1999. 43 subjects. All had experienced recurring episodes. All had reported a presence in the room. All were asked independently, using a standardized image selection protocol, to identify the entity they had seen. 39 of the 43 selected the same image. The image was not from a horror film. It was not a pop culture figure. It was a sketch produced by a clinical illustrator based on the average descriptions from 17 previous separate studies conducted between 1952 and 1997, spanning subjects from the United States, Japan, Nigeria, Brazil, and Canada. Sanchez's full report, reference GB NP 199901114, was filed February 3, 1999. It was published in the Journal of Sleep Research, Volume 8, Issue 2. The publication omitted the image. The paper included a footnote. Visual consistency across subject cohorts warrants further cross-cultural investigation. No further cross-cultural investigation was formally funded. Corinne Elliott, 42, IT consultant, Somerset, England, 1998. The first time I woke up, I thought it was my husband standing there. I said his name. It didn't answer. Then I realized my husband was in bed next to me, and this thing was standing between the bed and the window, and it was, I don't know how to say this, it was the wrong shape. Not wrong like a monster. Wrong like something that had almost got the shape right but had made 1 or 2 small mistakes. It knew I was awake. You could tell. It had been waiting for me to wake up. Karen Elliott has not participated in follow-up research. Her family confirms she no longer discusses the events of 1998. 400 BC, Greece. Hippocratic records from the school at Kos, 400 BC, describe patients experiencing nocturnal suffocation by unseen presence. The Greek physician Galen, 150 AD, described the same phenomenon using the term ephiouts, from the verb meaning to leap upon. The creature was understood to have physical weight. 800 AD, Scandinavia. Old Norse texts refer to the Mara, a creature, sometimes described as a spirit of the dead, that rides sleeping humans in the night. The weight of the Mara was said to cause chest compression severe enough to crack ribs. The English word nightmare derives from Mara. It is not a metaphor. It was a name. 1628, London. Records from the London Coroner's Office dated March through September 1628 document 11 cases of night press, defined in the coroner's files as death by supernatural compression during sleep. Modern forensic pathologists who have reviewed the descriptions suggest 3 of the 11 cases may represent what is now diagnosed as sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. The remaining 8 cases have no modern explanation. Something has been in human bedrooms since before bedroom was a word. It has different names in every language. It has the same face in every country. August 2003, Sacramento, California. Marcus Webb, 29, graphic designer, began experiencing sleep paralysis in March 2003 after moving into a rental property on Garrison Street, Sacramento. By August, he had documented 31 episodes in a journal his sister later gave to researchers at UC Davis. August 4th, 2003, 3:17 a.m. Marcus Webb, 29, graphic designer, Sacramento, 2003. By August, I knew what was coming. You get to know the feeling your body lets you know about 3 seconds before the paralysis hits, like a wave coming in. I'd lie there and I'd think, okay, here it is again, and I'd look at the corner. It was always the corner. Different corners in different rooms. I tested this. I moved my bed 4 times. It was always whatever corner was furthest from the door. It would stand there and it would look at me and I would look at it, and then it would take a step forward and I would be convinced, absolutely convinced, that this was the time it wasn't going to stop, that it was going to keep coming until it was right over me, but it always stopped. It stopped at the same point every time, about a foot from the bed, and I realized that wasn't random. That distance was deliberate. It was showing me how close it could get. It was making a point. Webb moved out of the Garrison Street property in September 2003. The episodes followed him to his new address on Cedar Grove Avenue. He moved 4 more times over the next 2 years. The episodes followed him each time. Webb moved to his sister's property in Portland, Oregon in December 2005. According to his sister, Diane Webb, he has not reported an episode since February 2006. He declined to be interviewed for this project. His sister reports he becomes visibly distressed when the subject is raised. His last journal entry, dated February 19, 2006, consists of 1 sentence. It stopped. I don't know why it stopped. I'm afraid to ask. June 1994, Cairo, Egypt. Dr. Amira Fathi, psychiatrist, Cairo University Hospital, documented 47 cases of what her patients called jathum, from the Arabic word meaning crouching thing. All 47 patients described a dark figure, crouching or standing, often at the foot of the bed or in the nearest corner. All 47 described the inability to move. 43 of the 47 described a sensation of being watched specifically, rather than merely perceived. The distinction, noted Dr. Fathi in her 1995 paper, being that the subjects report certainty that the entity is not simply present in the room, but is focused, with intention, upon them specifically. Dr. Fathi's 1995 paper was translated into English in 2001. It received 14 academic citations in the 2 years following publication. Then citations stopped entirely. Researchers contacted for this project were unable to explain why. The Garrison Street property in Sacramento has had 14 tenants since Marcus Webb. According to public records, the average tenancy is approximately 7 months. The folklore record is explicit. It is also consistent in ways that should be deeply uncomfortable for anyone who takes consistency seriously. The Old Hag of Newfoundland, documented in academic literature since at least 1970, described in oral tradition for centuries prior. Physical, heavy, sits on the chest. She has a face described variously as ancient, rotted, or simply wrong. She has appeared in formal reports from Newfoundland's medical system as recently as 2018. The Kanashibari of Japan, which translates as bound in iron. Japanese medical and folkloric literature documents this phenomenon continuously from the Heian period, approximately 800 AD, to the present. The entity in Japanese accounts is not the old hat, but in 73% of Japanese clinical cases reviewed by researcher Dr. Koji Yamamoto in 2016, the entity was described as tall, dark, and specifically attentive, statistically indistinguishable from non-Japanese case descriptions. The Papabawa of Zanzibar, first formally documented in 1972, though local oral tradition places it much earlier. Episodes cluster multiple witnesses in the same neighborhood, same week. The Papabawa is understood to select victims deliberately. In documented outbreaks, 1972, 1989, 1995, 2001, and 2007, hospital admissions for sleep-related psychological distress spiked by measurable percentages in the weeks following reported Papabawa activity. Dr. Yusuf Akafar, professor of ethnopsychology, University of Lagos, 2020. What is categorically unusual is not the hallucination. Sleep paralysis hallucinations are well understood. What is unusual is that across cultures without contact, without shared media, without common mythology, the same specific behaviors are attributed to the entity. It stands in corners. It approaches the bed. It demonstrates awareness of the witness. It stops at a consistent distance. These are behavioral specifics, not general impressions. Behavioral specifics do not emerge from random neurological norms. September 2019, BIRMINJHAM, UK. Sleep researcher Dr. Oliver Crane, working independently, compiled a dataset of 1,847 first-person sleep paralysis accounts collected from 6 countries between 2015 and 2019. He fed the descriptions of the entity into a standardized language processing analysis. The resulting behavioral profile was consistent across 1,412 of the 1,847 accounts, 76.4%. Crane submitted his findings to 3 journals. All 3 declined to publish without explanation. He posted the dataset to an academic repository in November 2019. The post was taken down in January 2020. The repository cited data integrity concerns. Crane disputes this characterization. He stopped researching sleep paralysis in March 2020. He has not publicly explained why. What I am about to tell you is documented. It is on record. It exists in files that are technically public but practically inaccessible. I found them. I read every page. You need to hear what is inside, because what happened once is still happening. The file ends there. What it cannot record is what happened inside Daniel's chest when he began to understand that this was not his story alone, that it had never been anyone's story alone, that the figure in his corner was the same figure in every corner, everywhere, since before the word corner existed. That is a very specific kind of loneliness. Daniel found the research. Of course he did. He was a man in the internet age with a problem he couldn't solve and a growing compulsion to find an explanation that would either make the terror stop or, failing that, make it make sense. He found the academic papers. He found the folklore. He found the Reddit threads and the message boards and the blogs and the YouTube channels with their black screens and their quiet voices. He found people like him, thousands of them, tens of thousands, people who'd woken up paralyzed in the dark with something in the corner and who had found, as Daniel had found, that there were no satisfying answers, only data, mountains of data all pointing at the same shape in the same corner. He found the Hat Man. That's what a significant subset of the accounts called it, the Hat Man, because a specific variant of the sleep paralysis visitor was described as wearing a wide-brimmed hat, a fedora or a cowboy hat or something old and wide, and a long dark coat, and this variant was reported with startling frequency across accounts that had no connection to each other. A man in Idaho in 2009, a A woman in the Philippines in 2014. A 16-year-old in Birmingham who wrote about it in a school journal that his teacher uploaded to a research forum in 2017. A retired school teacher in Osaka who described it to a Japanese sleep clinic in 2011. The same hat, the same coat, the same corner, the same patients. Daniel's visitor did not wear a hat, but he read the accounts with a horrible feeling of recognition that he could not have explained to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. The feeling of reading about your own experience in another person's words and realizing that the experience you thought was private, the experience you thought was specific to you, to your apartment, to your particular broken corner of the night, was not private at all. And then he made the connection that broke through the last of his comfort. The accounts clustered at 3 a.m., not universally, but statistically, consistently, measurably. The majority of sleep paralysis episodes across studies, across cultures, across the historical record occurred in the window between 3:00 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. His own episodes had been at 3:08, 3:09, 3:11, 3:11, 3:17. There was a word for that window. He'd heard it before without fully registering it. The witching hour, the devil's hour, the inverse of 3 p.m., which medieval Christian tradition identified as the hour of Christ's death. 3 a.m., the hour of inversion. He did not believe in the devil. He was not religious. He did not think that any of this had anything to do with medieval Christian theology. But he thought about the word inversion for a long time. February came and it stopped. Just like that. He woke at 3 a.m. on February 3rd and his body was his own, and the corner was empty, and the nightlight was on and Priya was warm beside him. And outside the window Columbus was doing what Columbus does in February, being cold, being gray, being thoroughly unimpressive. And he lay there for a long time in the dark and waited and nothing came. Nothing came on February 4th either, or the 5th, or the 6th. By February 10th, he was sleeping through the night and waking to his alarm and feeling, for the first time in months, like a man who had passed through something and emerged on the other side, tired but intact. He told Priya it had stopped. She said, "Thank God." She squeezed his hand. He felt the knot in his chest, the one he'd been carrying since November, loosen slightly. Not entirely, slightly. But slightly is a lot when you've been carrying something heavy. By Valentine's Day, he had stopped checking the corner before he closed his eyes. That's recovery, he thought. That's what recovery feels like, not forgetting exactly, but the act of looking becoming less automatic. The vigilance unwinding. He took Priya to a restaurant they both liked, and he had wine and he laughed at her stories, and he felt, for a whole evening, entirely like himself. He should have known. You always should know, and you never do. That's the architecture of the thing. It doesn't end when the appearances stop. The appearances stop so that you will put your guard down, so that you will relax into normalcy, into the warmth of a life that feels returned to you, so that when it comes back it finds you softer, more vulnerable, less braced. February 28th, 3:18 in the morning. He woke and could not move, and the nightlight was dark, and the figure was standing not in the corner, not at the foot of the bed, but right beside him, 6 inches from his face, so close that if it had breath, if it breathed, he would have felt it. It did not breathe. This close, he could confirm that it did not breathe. He could see it, really see it, in a way he hadn't before, because it was close enough now that even the ambient city light coming through the curtains was sufficient. And what he saw, or rather, what he did not see, the specific and particular absence at the center of its face, where features should have been, stayed with him in a way that the previous months had not, because somehow the absence was worse than anything a face might have held, because it suggested that what was standing beside his bed had never needed a face, had never needed to present itself as anything other than what it was, which was something that had always been there, which had simply, until now, been willing to stand at a distance. He told Priya everything the next morning. the whole truth. He sat at the kitchen table with his second coffee going cold in front of him, and he told her all of it. Not the softened version, not the version designed to be credible, but the actual version. The version with the nightlight and the bathrobe and the chair and February 28th. The version with the no face. She listened. She didn't move from the other side of the table. When he was done, she said, "How long has it been at 6 inches?" He looked at her. "You said it's been getting closer," she said. "Each time, it's been getting closer for how long?" He hadn't thought about it like that. He'd been tracking episodes but not trajectories. He went to get the first notebook. He came back and they sat together and went through it. November corner. November 14th, same corner but clearer. December closer to the bed. January at the foot of the bed. January 22nd standing between him and the door. February 3rd, nothing. Through February, nothing. February 28th, 6 inches. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It took a month off, to let you relax, and then it came back and it was where it would have been if it had just kept coming." He stared at her. "It's not random," she said. She was very calm. It was the kind of calm that is actually fear that has processed itself. It's not random and it's not getting more aggressive. It's just approaching, systematically, like it's working up to something. He thought about Marcus Webb's journal entry. It stopped. I don't know why it stopped. I'm afraid to ask. He thought about the folklore, the old hag, the Mara, the Jathun, the Kanashibari. He thought about everything the accounts described. The approach, the closeness, the consistency, the patience. The patience of something that has always known it, has all the time it needs. He asked Priya, working up to what? She didn't answer. She was looking at the second chair, the one she always pushed in, automatically, the one that had been turned away from the table since the beginning. She was looking at it the way you look at something you've been choosing not to look at for a long time. "Priya," he said, "has it been?" "In my dreams," she said quietly. "Just in the corner, I thought it was just a dream." She looked at him. Her face was completely still. "How long for you before it came when you were awake?" He remembered November 7th, the first night, the feeling of something wrong in a room that looked perfectly right. 3 weeks, he said. Priya nodded slowly, as though he'd confirmed something she already knew. Outside, Columbus was gray and ordinary. Inside, something had changed about the air in the apartment, some quality of it, some temperature or weight, and neither of them could have said when exactly it had changed, only that it had, and that it had been changing for longer than either of them had noticed. What you just heard was only the beginning. They didn't leave. That's the thing you want to know, isn't it? That's the thing outside the horror story that never makes sense to the people outside it. Why didn't they leave? But it was February and their lease ran through August, and more importantly, and this is the part, the real part, they had already understood by then that the apartment was not the issue. Marcus Webb had moved 5 times. The episodes followed him. The folklore is full of people who moved. The entity is in the literature of 100 cultures, and every single culture agrees. Moving doesn't help. Leaving the country doesn't help. You cannot vacate a problem that exists in the space between waking and sleeping. You cannot find a safer address for the threshold. So they stayed, and they started keeping the notebooks together, and Priya's episodes began. Hers were different from his in one specific and notable way. In Priya's episodes, the figure was smaller. She described it as child-sized, which she said with the careful flatness of a person conveying information they would prefer not to be conveying. Child-sized, standing in the corner closest to the window, always facing her, not approaching, not moving at all, just standing in the specific stillness of something that knows it has been seen. She did not tell Daniel this for 3 days. He understood why. Because saying it out loud made it real in a way that your private paralyzed terror at 3 a.m. does not. Daniel was not sleeping. Not really. He was lying next to Priya and entering a version of sleep that was thin and watchful, a doze just deep enough for the body to hold itself together, with one part of his mind permanently stationed at the border, scanning. He'd spoken to a therapist. The therapist said hypervigilance is a common response to sleep disturbances, and disrupted sleep creates a feedback loop of anxiety. And these things were true in the way that technically accurate information is true when it leaves out the only part that matters. On March 7th, Priya's figure moved for the first time. It moved toward the door. She watched it, paralyzed, as it left the corner, walked to the bedroom door and stood in the doorway. Then it turned and looked back at her. Then it was gone. She was alone in the bedroom. Daniel was in the living room. He had started sleeping on the couch because he couldn't sleep in the bed. She lay there for a long time. Then she called his name. He came to the bedroom door and stood in the exact spot where the figure had been standing a moment before. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. He came and lay down beside her on top of the covers, and they looked at the ceiling together. The last ordinary thought Daniel Avraham had was this: I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it has ever wanted. And I'm starting to think that's the whole point. That was the last normal thought he would have. I do not use the word normal lightly. I use it the way one might use the word sure, while watching it disappear behind you. I shall not attempt to convince you of my sanity. The attempt would be unworthy, not because the question is unanswerable, but because the question I have come to understand is the wrong one entirely. What is sanity, after all, but the mind's agreement with itself about the nature of what is real? And what happens to sanity when what is real refuses, absolutely, methodically, night after night, to correspond to the framework the sane mind has constructed for it? I have read everything. I have read the clinical literature with its clean language and its reassuring diagrams of the hypnagogic corridor, and its careful insistence that what presents itself as supernatural is merely neurological, merely the brain's waking apparatus misaligned by seconds with the body's sleeping one, a temporal glitch, no more terrifying, when properly understood, than a light switch that takes a moment to respond. I have read this. I have studied it. I have repeated it to myself in the hours before dawn. It does not account for the smell. This is the detail that is never in the literature. It is not in the clinical papers. It is mentioned, obliquely, in 3 of the historical accounts and twice in the folklore transcriptions, and in a single first-person submission to a sleep research forum in 2013 that was removed within the week for reasons the moderators declined to specify. But it is not in the literature. The smell, the quality of air in the room at the moment of paralysis, a coldness that is not temperature, a heaviness that is not humidity, something old in it, something that the rational mind, desperate, identifies as a drafty room, a ventilation issue, a neighbor's cooking, anything at all, rather than what the deep animal part of the brain recognizes immediately and without any possibility of misidentification. The smell of something that was here before the building, before the street, before the city. I did not want to know this. I want that recorded clearly. I did not seek this knowledge. I did not pursue it with the enthusiasm of the collector or the recklessness of the thrill seeker. I arrived at it the way one arrives at a terrible truth in a long corridor, by walking, with perfectly reasonable purpose, toward a door that turned out to open somewhere unexpected. And yet, I cannot stop. This is what the literature also fails to convey, and what I believe the literature has perhaps been constructed, deliberately or otherwise, to conceal: the compulsion, the return, not merely the return of the entity, its faithful, scheduled arrivals at the threshold, but the return of the mind to it. The way the episode, once experienced, becomes a fixed point around which all subsequent thought orbits. I think about it during breakfast. I think about it at work, in meetings, in conversations. I lie down at night and I am afraid, genuinely, specifically, bodily afraid, and yet somewhere beneath the fear there is something else. Something I am embarrassed to name and which I shall name anyway, because dishonesty is the only luxury I can no longer afford. Anticipation. I have charted the trajectory of my own dissolution with the precision of a cartographer mapping a coastline that is vanishing even as the survey is conducted. Methodical, careful, documenting the recession of what was formerly solid ground. First, the normalization. The episode becomes routine. The terror does not diminish, hear me when I say this. The terror does not diminish, but it is terror the way that weather is terror. Expected, calibrated for, incorporated into the operational assumptions of daily life. I check the corner the way I check the weather app. I note the nightlight. I have a procedure. The procedure makes me feel in the daylight that I have the situation in hand. The procedure is, of course, useless, but it provides the particular comfort of feudal rituals, which is all I have. Second, the questions change. The early questions were defensive. How do I make it stop? How do I explain it? Is there medication? Is there treatment? Is there somewhere I can go? The questions now are different. Why does it come to the same corner? Why this hour? Why across every culture that has ever documented this does the distance between entity and subject close by increments slowly, patiently, over a period of weeks or months before stopping? Why stop? Why not simply arrive? What is it waiting for? Third, and this is the thing I did not want to write but cannot in good conscience omit, I have begun to wonder if the approach is not threatening at all. If the approach is, from the entity's perspective, assuming perspective is a concept that applies something more like an introduction. A slow, courteous introduction. The way you might approach a frightened animal. Not quickly, not aggressively, incrementally, giving it time to adjust to your presence. If you are still with me, if you have not yet turned away, write in the comments. The walls remember. Let me know I am not alone in this. Let me know you understand what I mean when I say that the worst part is not the fear. The worst part is the question I cannot stop asking at 3 a.m. in the dark. The question that I suspect the figure in the corner has been patiently waiting for me to arrive at. The question that feels like the entire architecture of these months of terror has been designed, methodically and with great care, to bring me to. What if I let it come the rest of the way? I have not, I would not. The sane portion of what remains of my mind diminished, embattled but present refuses. But the question has become a resident. It has moved in. It is there every morning beside the fear. It wears the same face as the figure in the corner, which is to say it wears no face at all, and it simply waits. The documentation, the notebooks, have taken on a life I did not anticipate when I began them. 114 entries. I have read them back, all of them, in order. What strikes me, what has struck me with the force of a discovery that on some level I have been avoiding is that the entries change, not merely in content, in tone. The early entries are the entries of a frightened man trying to impose order on something that resists it. The writing is neat. The clinical, the dates, the durations. The descriptions careful, controlled, the diction of a man who is performing reasonableness for himself, who is saying, see, I am handling this. I am documenting this. Documentation is mastery. Documentation is distance. By entry 60, the handwriting has changed. Larger, less careful, more pressure on the pen. The descriptions grow longer, more specific, more interior. Less saw figure in corner, duration 41 seconds and more. I am quoting myself now. More, the smell was back and stronger. And there is something about it I can only describe as intentional, as though the smell itself is not a byproduct but a communication. A language I do not know how to read but am becoming, against my will, more fluent in. This is entry 61. I wrote this. I do not fully recognize the person who wrote it. Entry 89. It stood beside me and I could see it in detail, and the detail was there is no face. I keep using this phrase, there is no face, but this is imprecise. It is not that the space where a face should be is blank. It is that the space where a face should be is active, is doing something, is looking. I have been asleep, genuinely, deeply asleep. I am fairly certain in the following sense, that the narrative I am living and the narrative I am documenting have diverged. that what I think I remember and what the notebooks contain are not exactly the same story. There are entries I do not remember writing. Entry 102, I did not know what this entry said until I read it back. I could not have written it. My handwriting, my words. I am afraid not of the figure, not anymore or not exactly. I am afraid of the entries I haven't written yet, of what they will say, of the question in entry 102, the one I apparently asked, the one I apparently answered, the one I will not repeat here, because repeating it would make it real, and I am clinging to the distinction between written and real with everything I have left, which may not at this point be very much at all. But do not think, do not for one moment believe that you are simply listening to a story. What I am telling you is real. It has always been real. And the reason I know this, the reason I cannot stop, is that it is still happening, right now, as I speak these words to you in the dark. And so my mind, what remained of it, turned at last to the question I had been circling for days. Not what had I seen, but what precisely had seen me. Let us consider, with the dispassion that the subject demands and that the subject will, in time, make impossible, the question of what the sleep paralysis entity actually is. The neurological explanation, familiar, reassuring, clinically endorsed, holds that the entity does not exist, that it is a hallucination produced by the collision of REM atonia persisting into wakefulness with the brain's pattern recognition architecture, which evolved specifically to detect humanoid forms in ambiguous visual environments, and will do so even when the environment contains no actual humanoid form to detect. The pressure on the chest, diaphragm mechanics complicated by conscious awareness of breath, the sense of presence, the temporoparietal junction, briefly uncalibrated, generating the experience of other without the physical correlate. This explanation is internally coherent. It is also, I submit, inadequate, not because the neurological mechanisms it describes are inaccurate, but because neurological mechanism cannot account for what the entity does. A hallucination born of random neural firing should be random. It should vary. It should reflect the individual's personal iconography of fear, their specific anxieties, their particular history, their cultural programming. And it does in a small percentage of cases. But in the overwhelming majority, 76.4%, as the suppressed Crane dataset established before its removal, it does not. In the majority, something specific appears. Something that has not varied appreciably in its description across 4,000 years of human testimony. Consider what this implies. Consider it at scale, not the scale of clinical convenience, but the scale that the evidence actually demands. Consider that there is something that uses the corridor between sleeping and waking as a point of access, that it is not a human creation, not a human fear projection, not a cultural artifact, but something that encountered humanity at the dawn of documented consciousness and has been present in consistent form in every bedroom, in every era, in every geography since, that it predates every religion that has ever attempted to name it, that it predates every language in which it has been described, that it was attending human sleep before humans had words for sleep. Dr. Marcus Ellery, Theoretical Neurocognition Institute, Cambridge, 2022. The cross-cultural consistency problem is the one that keeps me awake at night, and I am aware of the irony of that statement. We have a neurological phenomenon that should produce individual, culturally inflected experiences, producing instead a statistically homogeneous entity description. The only honest scientific answer to that discrepancy is, we do not know why. The dishonest but more comfortable answer, which is what most of the literature gives you, is coincidence. We are not dealing with coincidence. At 76.4% cross-cultural consistency, across 1,847 cases, we are not dealing with coincidence. What we are dealing with may have no name that human language can approximate. The names humanity has given it, the Mara, the old hag, the Jathum, the Hat Man, the Shadow Person, are all at best descriptions of its preferred presentation. They are what it chooses to show. They tell us nothing about what it is beneath that choice. And what it is beneath that choice, what it is in itself, in the fullness of its existence which preceded and will post-date the entirety of human civilization, is something that the mind, confronted with the genuine data, does not want to contemplate, at all. The question of what exists in the corridor between sleeping and waking is not, if approached without the prejudice of the clinically comfortable, a question about human neurology. The human brain is, in the totality of cosmic time, an extraordinarily recent development. The corridor, the threshold state, the hypnagogic zone, the space between is not a human invention. It is a structural feature of consciousness itself, which is to say, if one takes seriously the philosophical implications of what consciousness actually is and is not, it is a structural feature of reality, a seam, a joint between states. Seams, in my experience of the literature, are interesting to things that know about them. The accounts that describe what the entity does during extended episodes, the accounts beyond the standard 3-minute duration, the rare and troubling cases of episodes lasting 12, 20, 45 minutes, documented in specific clinical records from 1967, 1984, and 2001, that are technically available in archived journals and practically never cited, describe behavior that is not the behavior of a hallucination. A hallucination is passive. It does not move with purpose. It does not stop at consistent distances. It does not turn its attention between sleeping and waking occupants of the same room with what witnesses, consistently, describe as deliberateness. It does not, in the 45-minute case from Cologne, 2001, a case I will not describe in full because full description serves no constructive purpose, and because the researcher who documented it, Dr. Henrik Brouwer, retired from research 3 months after filing the case report, and has not, as of this writing, spoken publicly about it since. It does not do what the entity in that case was observed to do in the final minutes before the subject regained movement. I will say only this about the Brouwer case, that what the entity was observed to do in those final minutes was consistent, in its structure, with the behavior of something engaged in a process. Not a threat display, not random movement, a process. Methodical and directed and aimed, though at what it was aimed, and to what end, Dr. Brouwer did not specify in his report, and when contacted for this project replied in a single email that read, "Some questions should not be answered even by those who know the answer. Please do not contact me again." What exists in the corridor cannot be contained by the clinical vocabulary we have built for it. It cannot be contained by the folkloric vocabulary, which is more honest about its nature but correspondingly less useful in dealing with it. It cannot ultimately be contained by language at all, which is perhaps why every tradition that has encountered it has developed, in parallel and without collaboration, the same fundamental advice. Don't look at it directly. Don't acknowledge it. Don't speak to it. Don't invite it to complete what it started. In 2017, a researcher named Avani Sharma at the Indian Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi, working from a grant that was formally rescinded 8 months into the project, completed a study that has never been formally published and exists in full only in a preprint repository under an anonymized account that Sharma has never confirmed or denied owning. The study, titled Behavioral Consistency in Hypnagogic Intrusion Phenomena, a pattern analysis, referenced here from the cached preprint archived by this project before the repository entry was deleted in December 2021, documented something that the suppressed Crane dataset had approached but not fully articulated. Sharma's analysis was not of what the entity looked like. The visual descriptions had been analyzed exhaustively. Sharma analyzed what the entity did. Specifically, she plotted across 2,314 documented cases the trajectory of approach over multiple episodes, the distance reduction, the incremental closing of the gap between entity and subject, night by night, episode by episode, over the weeks and months that witnesses described as their active period. The trajectory, plotted, was not random. It was not variable. It was consistent across subjects to a degree that Sharma described in her preprint as approaching the statistical definition of scheduled. Sharma's conclusion, the conclusion that, I suspect, is the reason the grant was rescinded and the preprint was deleted and the account was anonymized, was this. The approach is not a byproduct of the phenomenon. The approach is the phenomenon. Every episode, every inch of closed distance, every incremental step from corner to bedside to 6 inches is not escalation. It is progress. Something is progressing towards something. And based on the trajectory analysis, the mean completion point, the point at which the entity's approach, if continued at the documented rate, would bring it to zero distance, occurs, across Sharma's dataset at a statistically consistent interval, between 5 and 8 months from first episode. Sharma noted, in a handwritten addendum found at the end of the preprint, that she had experienced her first sleep paralysis episode the previous March, that it had begun with a figure in the corner, that she underlined this, she had not yet reached the 6-month mark. The preprint was uploaded on a September evening. The timestamp is 11:47 p.m. She never uploaded anything else. What you just heard was only the beginning. What has been described thus far, the human testimonies, the suppressed research, the cross-cultural consistency, the behavioral trajectory, represents only the outermost fragment of the truth, the portion accessible to human inquiry and human language. Beneath it lies a layer that the data implies but cannot directly address, the question of purpose. Not what the entity is, not how the approach is structured, but why, to what end, what it is ultimately after. The historical record is not silent on this question. It is simply consistent in a way that the modern literature has chosen not to engage with, because the consistent answer is not an answer that clinical frameworks have a vocabulary for. Every tradition that has named the sleep paralysis entity, the Mara, the Alp, the Kanashibari spirit, the Jinn of Islamic tradition, the succubus and incubus of medieval Europe, the Agwara of South American mythology, describes not only the physical approach but the goal of it. And the goal, across every tradition, is some version of the same thing. The entity is not trying to harm the sleeper. It is not here to cause fear, though fear is a byproduct. It is not here to observe, though observation is part of the process. It is here to enter. The traditions vary on the mechanism, possession in some, the absorption of a quality of the life force in others, in a few the opening of a channel that is then maintained in perpetuity. But the fundamental architecture is consistent. The entity approaches incrementally because it requires consent of a kind, not spoken consent, not conscious consent. A consent born of familiarity, of tolerance, of the slow erosion of the psychic resistance that the mind maintains against things that should not be permitted to cross from where they are to where we are. It approaches because the approach itself is the key. What has been described thus far represents only the outermost fragment of the truth, the portion that human language can approximate. What lies beneath that layer, what the deepest accounts suggest, is something for which no preparation is adequate. Nothing that follows can be unheard. You were warned. And so my mind, what remained of it, arrived at last at the question it had been approaching since November, not in the dark of 3 a.m., in the full light of a March afternoon, the most mundane possible setting for the most imponderable possible question. I have passed a point. I can identify the exact moment. It is, looking back at it now, clear in the way that only crossed thresholds ever become clear. In the passing they are invisible, in the retrospect they are a wall. The moment was this, entry 102. I did not want to read it. I knew, with the specific foreknowledge that the mind provides when it is protecting itself, that entry 102 contained something that could not be unread. I had not read it when I wrote it. I do not remember writing it, and I had been avoiding it since its discovery with the focused determination of a man who has identified exactly which door in his house he must not open. I opened it. The entry is dated March 12th. It is written in my hand with my pen. I confirm the ink, the pressure marks, the specific idiosyncratic shape of my capital letters. It is mine. It says, I invited it closer. Not aloud, I could not speak, but intentionally, deliberately. I stopped trying to wake myself. I stopped fighting the paralysis. I lay still and I thought clearly and with full awareness of what I was doing, come the rest of the way. And it had stopped. It did not come closer. It stood at 6 inches where it has stood for 2 weeks, and it stopped. And then, and this is what I cannot stop thinking about, it made a sound. The first sound it has ever made. Not a voice, not quite, but something that my mind, reaching for language, can only describe as recognition. As if my invitation, my conscious willingness, was noted, was appreciated, was filed away for future reference. I did not remember this. I do not remember this. I did not intend this. And yet I am looking at it in my own handwriting, and it is real, and I must live with the understanding that some part of me, some stratum of self beneath the one that answers to my name in the daylight, made a choice that the daylight self would not have made. The question I cannot answer and cannot stop asking, which of these selves is actually me? The one that wrote entry 102, the one that lay in the dark and chose, deliberately, to invite it closer, or the one that is reading it back now in horror? Which one was there first? It did not come when I invited it. I have said this, but I have not examined what this means, what the specific meaning is of the entity declining a deliberate invitation after weeks, months of systematic approach. Here is my theory, and I present it knowing that the constructing of theories is how the disintegrating mind maintains the illusion of mastery, knowing that the theory may be the last castle wall, and that what it holds back is not kept back for much longer. The approach is the invitation, not my verbal invitation, not the internal deliberate choosing of entry 102. Those are the consciousness acting on its own schedule, reaching conclusions the entity has already accounted for. The approach is the invitation. Every episode is a further incremental warming of the space between us. Every night I wake paralyzed in its presence. Every night I feel it close. It is closer not because it is advancing, but because I am retreating less. The fear does not diminish, but my body's response to the fear diminishes. The paralysis becomes familiar. The presence becomes, I want to find another word but cannot, becomes companionable, in the specific sense that the familiar is companionable even when it is terrifying. It has been teaching me to tolerate it. The entire month-long approach has been a lesson, and I, the sleepless, obsessive, notebook-filling, research-consuming, rational explanation-seeking I, have been an excellent student. Entry 102 is not evidence that the other self broke through. It is evidence that the education is complete. Priya left on March 15th. She left not in anger but in something worse, a grief-tinged practical decision, the kind you make when you understand that the place you are in is not improving and that remaining in it is costing you more than you can continue to pay. She packed carefully. She held me for a long time at the door. She said she loved me. She said she would answer her phone. I sat in the apartment alone for the first time in 2 years, and the quiet was a quality of quiet I had never experienced before. Not peaceful, listening. The apartment was listening. I was aware, as I have never been more starkly aware of anything in my life, that I was not alone, that I had not been alone since November. And that now that Priya was gone, now that the only other human presence was removed, the thing that shared the apartment with me had the full and undivided available space of my attention. I went to bed at 11. I closed my eyes. I lay in the dark and waited. It came at 3:11 precisely. And this time it did not stop at 6 inches. I have been writing around this for reasons I now recognize as the mind's final act of self-protection, and I shall write around it no longer. On the night of March 15th, Priya's first night in her sister's apartment, the entity crossed the distance to zero. It stood directly above me in the dark. It was close enough that, had it been physical in the way that a human being is physical, I would have felt its breath on my face. I did not feel breath. I felt something else, a pressure of attention that was not the chest weight, not the REM atonia, but something located specifically in the mind. Something I can only describe as a presence not at the body's surface but inside it, in the space behind the eyes, in the particular chamber of consciousness that you think of, if you think of it at all, as the room where you yourself live. It stood there. For how long, I cannot say. The paralysis prevents accurate timekeeping, and the experience of time during these episodes is not reliable under ordinary circumstances, and these circumstances were not ordinary. For however long it stood, above me, in me, with me in a way that I cannot describe with precision, because precision requires separation, and in that moment there was no separation. I understood something that I have been trying, for the 3 months since, to dismantle with the tools of reason. I understood that it had always been here, not since November, always, since before I had the capacity to perceive it. I understood that every human being has this, that the entity in the corner is not a visitor from outside the self. It is a resident of the space beneath consciousness, the vast space below the floor of what we can access in the daylight, the space that the sleeping brain briefly illuminates and then closes off again every morning at 6:47. I understood that the approach, the months of incremental closing, the education in tolerance, it had all been in service of one thing, not possession, not harm, not any goal that maps onto the vocabulary of horror. It had needed me to be willing to see it, to not look away, to lie still and receive the knowledge of what it actually was. Which is this, a part of myself I do not have access to in waking life, the oldest part, the part that was there before I had a name or a self or a concept of either. The paralysis ended, I could move. I did not move for a very long time. I had the thought, the single terrifying thought I have been circling for 3 months, and have finally brought myself to commit to writing. What if none of this was ever external? Enough of the theoretical, enough of the academic distance. What was found in that room, what has been found in thousands of rooms across 4,000 years, deserves to be described as it was, in full, in light, with nothing hidden. Let us talk about the body. What happens to the body? The medical literature describes sleep paralysis as the temporary inability to move during the transition between sleep and wakefulness. This is anatomically accurate. The mechanism is well understood. Glutamate and glycine inhibit motor neurons during REM sleep, preventing the body from acting out its dreams. Occasionally, this mechanism persists briefly into waking consciousness. The paralysis is temporary. The body returns to itself within minutes. What the medical literature describes is a mechanism. What the body experiences is something else entirely. Ask anyone who has been through a severe episode, not a brief 30-second freeze, but a full episode. The kind that goes 3, 5, 8 minutes. The kind with the full suite of accompaniments. Ask them what it feels like, and they will not describe malfunction. They will describe violation. The pressure on the chest is not abstract. It is weight, real, specific, directional weight pressing down with the consistency and particularity of hands. Subjects across the historical record, from the Norse Mara accounts to the 2019 case filings from the Edinburgh study, describe the pressure as having the texture of intentionality. Not the pressure of a dead weight, not the pressure of an object placed there. The pressure of something gripping, holding down, keeping in place. The body sweats. The heart rate elevates to levels that, in several documented cases, have been measured post-episode using heart rate monitors worn by study participants. Average peak of 147 beats per minute, sustained, during episodes. This is the heart rate of a person in genuine bodily fear. The body is not confused about whether this is happening. The body knows. The throat locks, not metaphorically. The muscles of the larynx, like all other voluntary muscles, are inhibited, which is why subjects cannot scream, cannot call for help, cannot make a sound beyond the minimal involuntary breathing that the diaphragm manages automatically. The voice is the first thing taken. In the longest documented episodes, the rare, terrible outliers subjects have described the sensation of the entity making contact. Physical contact, not violent, deliberate. A hand, or what the mind processes as a hand placed on the throat or the face, or specifically, in 3 separate accounts from 3 separate continents, over the eyes. Over the eyes. Not to blind, not as threat, in the way that a parent might cover a child's eyes to shield them from something the child should not see. In the way that you cover someone's eyes when you are about to show them something you want them to receive fully, without the distraction of what came before. The body remembers what the mind rationalizes away. Subjects who have undergone sleep paralysis consistently show elevated cortisol levels and modified stress response signatures for days following major episodes. The body files these experiences not under neurological glitch, but under real event. The body is not interested in what the rational mind decides about what happened. The body knows what was in the room. Let me describe what has been described. Let me give it the attention it deserves, not the quick glance of the frightened or the clinical distance of the academic, but the full direct gaze that the thing has been asking for, in its patient and methodical way, for as long as it has been standing in the corners of rooms. The figure that appears most frequently in the cross-cultural literature, the variant that Crane's dataset identifies in 76.4% of cases, is tall. Taller than a human being in a way that is not dramatic, not monstrous, just slightly wrong in the proportions. The wrongness is specific. The limbs are correct in number and approximate placement, but slightly attenuated, as though the blueprint for a human body has been scaled by someone who understood the concept, but not the reality. It is dark, not black, not the absence of light, but dark in the way that certain things are dark, a quality of absorbing the available light rather than reflecting it, so that the eye, in trying to focus on it, keeps losing the definition and sliding away. Subjects who have seen it in lit rooms rare, and the accounts are some of the most disturbing in the literature, describe this same quality. It does not cast a shadow. It simply does not engage with light the way matter engages with light. The face, or the absence of it, is the detail that every account returns to, because describing a face as absent is technically accurate and entirely misleading. There is no blank where the face should be. There is instead a quality of attention, a focused, specific, personal attention that bypasses the visual entirely. You do not see it looking at you. You feel it looking at you in the same way and with the same certainty that you feel someone standing behind you in a dark hallway. The pre-visual, pre-rational certainty of the nervous system, which evolved specifically to detect attention from other entities and which cannot be fooled about this. Cannot be fooled. The nervous system does not hallucinate directed attention. It registers it. And the attention is, this is the detail that I find most compelling, most important, most deliberately buried in the clinical literature. The attention is not hostile. It is not aggressive. It is not predatory. It is interested. The entity, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, however it accesses the corridor between sleeping and waking, is interested in you, in the specific, particular you, in the internal architecture of your fear and your memory and your history, and the specific quality of your consciousness that makes you different from every other consciousness in every other bedroom in every other city. This is why the approach is gradual. This is why, in the Cologne 2001 case, it did what it did in those final 45 minutes. This is why the research keeps getting suppressed and the researchers keep walking away, and the data keeps matching across cultures and centuries, without anyone in the official literature wanting to say what the matching actually implies. The entity in the corner of your room is not there because you are vulnerable. It is not there because something went wrong in your REM cycle. It is there because you are interesting to it. And something that has been watching human beings for 4,000 years. Something that attends every bedroom in every era. Something that approaches with patience and precision and apparent genuine interest. Something like that learns a great deal about what it watches. The case that the academic literature will not discuss, the one that Brouwer documented and then sealed and then stepped away from forever, involved a subject in Cologne, Germany, in November of 2001. A woman, 31 years old, a secondary school teacher. Her name, at her family's request, is not included here. She had been experiencing sleep paralysis for approximately 6 months. Standard trajectory, progressive approach. By November, the figure was at bedside proximity, which is where it had been for 3 weeks. Brouwer had been monitoring her with a combination of polysomnographic equipment and video recording as part of an IRB-approved study. On the night of November 17, 2001, she experienced an episode lasting 45 minutes and 11 seconds. The polysomnographic recording confirms she was partially awake throughout. The video recording, which Brouwer retained in his personal possession and has refused to release, recorded the room from a corner-mounted camera. Brouwer's written case notes, obtained from a research archive before the archive's reorganization removed them from accessible cataloging, describe the video recording in clinical language that becomes, by the middle of the document, something else. He describes the entity as visible on the video. He uses the word visible without qualification. He describes its approach over the 45-minute duration. He describes it reaching the woman's bedside. He describes what happened next in a single paragraph that has been redacted from the available copy, blacked out with a marker, firmly, with a handwritten note beside the redaction that reads, "Not for distribution." What is not redacted? His description of the woman when the episode ended. She could move. She was physically unharmed. Her vitals were elevated but within survivable parameters. She was looking at the corner where the entity had first appeared, not at the ceiling or at the equipment or at Brouwer, who was in the room. She was looking at the corner with an expression that Brouwer, in his clinical notes, spends 3 sentences trying to describe. He cycles through contemplative, transformed, resolute. He settles, finally, on a word I did not expect to find in a medical case report. Relieved. He asked her what had happened. She said, "It finished." He asked her what had finished. She looked at him and then looked back at the corner and said, "I think I know what I am now." Brouwer asked her to elaborate. She said, "I can't explain it in a way you'd understand, but I'm not afraid anymore." Then she asked him to turn off the recording equipment. He did. He never published the case. He never returned to sleep research. His retirement notice, filed December 3, 2001, cited personal reasons. The woman went back to teaching in January. She retired from the school in 2019. Former colleagues describe her as unchanged professionally, warm, well-liked, an excellent teacher. They describe one difference, noted consistently and independently by 4 separate colleagues when contacted for this project. She is the only person they have ever met who does not seem afraid of anything. This is the part that was edited out, cut from every version you have ever encountered, because someone decided you could not handle the truth of what was found in that place. They were trying to be kind. I am not going to be kind. You asked for the truth. Here it is. What you just heard was only the beginning. The aftermath. Let us talk about the aftermath, not of the individual episode, not of the Cologne case or the notebooks or Priya leaving, but the larger aftermath, the texture of the life that exists on the other side of this experience. What remains when the active period ends? what it leaves behind in the body and the mind, and the specific quality of the way the world looks at 3 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday, 5 years after the last episode. It leaves a door. This is not metaphor. This is the consistent report across survivor accounts, across the people who came through active periods and emerged into years of silence and found ways to reconstruct ordinary lives from the materials of ordinary days. They describe a door. An internal door, a feature of the self's architecture that was not there before and is there now and will always be there. A door that is closed, usually, and that they have learned to function with, to move around without touching, to accept as part of the floor plan. It is a door to the corridor, the thing between sleeping and waking, the scene. They can feel it at certain times. At the edge of sleep, obviously, that is when it is most present, most material, most requiring of active management. But also at other times, unexpectedly. In a quiet room in the afternoon. In the moment of a strong emotion, grief or joy or fear, when the normal buffer between the conscious and whatever lies beneath it thins. They feel the door the way you feel a cold draft from the other side of a wall. The wall is there. The seal is intact. But you know what's on the other side of it because you have been on the other side of it, and the cold of it has gotten into your bones and doesn't come out. What the Cologne woman said, "I know what I am now," is not unique to her case. It appears in variant forms in survivor accounts across cultures, across centuries. The Japanese accounts from the Heian period reference a quality they call miga sameda, the eyes have truly opened. The Newfoundland old hag survivors in the oral tradition say that afterward you know your real name, not the name your parents gave you but something older. The West African accounts from the Jinn tradition describe survivors as possessing two sights, the sight of ordinary daylight and a secondary sight that was not there before. What these survivors know that they didn't know before, what the entity in the corridor apparently teaches or shows or opens, is a question that I could not answer without asking them. And when I asked them, what I found was this. They don't have a way to explain it that translates. They try. They reach for language. They say, "I know that I'm not only this." They say, "I know where the edge is." They say, "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, not because the dark is safe, but because I know what's in it." What's in it has been standing in the corner of their room, patiently, since November, or since 400 BC, or since before the first human being had a corner to stand in. And whatever it is, whatever it knows, whatever it has been attending to for the entirety of human sleep, it is not done. That is what happened to the mind. Now I will tell you what happened to the record. March 2021. SDANFORD University Sleep Medicine Center. A study conducted between January and August 2021, funded by NIH Grant R01, NS 114025, enrolled 312 participants with documented sleep paralysis histories. The study's stated objective: to determine neurological correlates of sleep paralysis phenomenology using fMRI and polysomnographic monitoring. The study was completed. All 312 participants completed the protocol. Results were presented at the SLEEP 2021 annual meeting in June of that year. The presentation included one slide that was removed from all circulated copies of the conference deck before distribution. The slide has been reconstructed from the notes of two attendees, obtained separately and independently for this project. The slide showed fMRI data from participants during active sleep paralysis episodes induced in the lab setting. The highlighted regions of activation were not the temporal parietal junction or the visual association cortices, the regions the existing literature had identified as the neurological sites of the hallucinations. The highlighted region was the default mode network, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, specifically the subregion associated with self-referential processing. The entity, when it appeared in the lab-induced episodes, activated the part of the brain responsible for the sense of self, not the fear response, not the visual cortex, the self. Dr. Patricia Morrow, neurologist, Stanford Sleep Center 2021. I can't tell you why that slide was pulled from the deck. I can tell you what it showed. The activation pattern during entity perception was statistically identical, to the activation pattern we see in subjects asked to contemplate their own identity. Who am I? That question. That's the overlap. I don't know what that means. I know it kept me awake. Dr. Morrow requested that her name not be attached to this information. She was informed this project would not honor that request if attribution was required for verification. February 2022, Tokyo University Sleep Laboratory. Dr. Koji Yamamoto's team documented 42 cases of sleep paralysis in a 6-week study. In 11 of the 42 cases, the entity appeared on the infrared monitoring camera, not as a visual artifact, as a thermal anomaly, a cold spot, specifically localized, specifically mobile, specifically positioned in the areas of the room that subjects simultaneously reported the entity occupying. This finding was included in the preliminary report submitted to the funding body on March 3, 2022. It was not included in the final published paper, which appeared in Sleep Medicine Reviews in September 2022. The discrepancy between the preliminary report and the published paper was noted by one reviewer, who raised it with the journal. The journal's response, on file with this project. The discrepancy is the result of data quality concerns identified during final analysis. Yamamoto has not commented publicly. The pattern is not rare. The pattern is the rule. 1984, University of Connecticut. Dr. Raymond Hufford documented 93 sleep paralysis cases in Newfoundland. His 1984 paper, The Terror That Comes in the Night, remains one of the most cited sleep paralysis studies in academic literature. What is less cited? The supplemental appendix, filed separately with the University Research Archive, containing a set of case descriptions that Hufford elected not to include in the published paper. The appendix contains 17 cases involving what Hufford called anomalous detail. Specifically, details provided by witnesses that could not have originated from suggestion, media exposure, or cultural transmission, because the details matched descriptions from traditions the witnesses had no documented access to. A 43-year-old fisherman from Bonavista, Newfoundland, who had never heard of the Japanese Kaneshibari, described his entity in terms that matched the standard Kaneshibari behavioral profile in 7 specific behavioral particulars. He had never been to Japan. He did not own a television. He had last left Newfoundland in 1971. Hufford filed the anomaly. He did not explain it. He did not attempt to explain it. His handwritten note on the appendix cover page. These cases are not consistent with hallucination-based explanation. I do not know what they are consistent with. Hufford died in 2005. His research archive at the University of Connecticut remains partially sealed pending a state review. The review has been ongoing since 2006. June 2019, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Gaston Ferreira, 28, student. First episode June 3, 2019. Progression, 26 episodes over 14 weeks. Documented in a public Instagram account, he began specifically to record his experiences, initially for the cathartic value of disclosure. His episode descriptions match the standard behavioral profile with unremarkable consistency. The relevant data point is this. Ferreira's 23rd episode, documented July 31st, included a detail he had not reported previously. The entity spoke. Not a word, not a sentence, a sound. He described it as follows. It made a sound that I can only call my name, not the sound of my name, it didn't speak, but the feeling of my name. Like someone reaching into the room and touching something with my name on it. His Instagram account was deleted August 14, 2019. Ferreira's account remains active but has not posted about sleep paralysis since. He responded to a direct message from this project with 4 words: "It doesn't come anymore." He did not respond to follow up. October 2023, Global. The American Sleep Association estimates that between 8% and 50% of people will experience at least one sleep paralysis episode in their lifetime. 75 million Americans, approximately 3.9 billion human beings globally, active right now, tonight, as you are listening to this, in every time zone, in every country, in thousands of rooms simultaneously. People are waking up and lying still and looking at the corner and feeling the weight and watching the approach. All of them seeing something that looks, to a statistically unignorable degree, the same. The last known person to provide a complete account of the full progression, from first episode through active period to resolution, and to then agree to discuss it publicly, in detail for the record, is a woman named Teresa Alvarez. Teresa is 41. She lives in Phoenix, Arizona. She is a registered nurse. She experienced sleep paralysis from the age of 23 through approximately age 28, 5 years. 63 documented episodes, full progression, full resolution. She agreed to a recorded interview for this project on September 14, 2023. The interview lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes. What follows is the relevant portion. Teresa Alvarez, 41, RN, Phoenix, Arizona, 2023. The worst part wasn't what I saw. I want to be clear about that. I've heard people say sleep paralysis is the scariest thing that ever happened to them, and for me it was. During the episodes it was terrifying. I won't downplay that. But the worst part was the daytime, the not sleeping part. Because once you've been in that state enough times, you start to feel the, I don't know what to call it, the thinness. Like there's a place in your awareness where the normal stuff stops and something else starts, and you can feel that edge. You can feel it at night, obviously, but you start to feel it during the day too, at certain moments. I'm at work and a patient isn't responding, and there's that moment of crisis, and I feel the edge. Like the fear opens it a little. I've made peace with it. That took a long time and a lot of therapy, and I won't pretend it was easy. But what I needed to make peace with wasn't the figure. The figure wasn't the trauma. The trauma was finding out that the world has more in it than I thought, and that some of what it has in it was interested in me, specifically, personally, by name, which is wonderful and absolutely horrifying in equal measure, and I've spent 15 years trying to hold both of those things at the same time. I don't miss the episodes. I'm glad they stopped. But I'll tell you this, and this is the thing I couldn't have said at 28, but I can say now, I'm glad it happened. I'm glad I know the corridor is there. I'm glad I know I'm not just this. Even if knowing costs something, it costs something every day. I'll pay it. Teresa Alvarez's last reported episode was October 3rd, 2018. Her last recorded words on the subject, in a follow-up email to this project, dated November 2023. Tell them the figure isn't the enemy. Tell them what they're afraid of is themselves. Current status: what is known, what is not known, what authorities will not say. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine's 2023 Clinical Guidelines on Sleep Paralysis, 14 pages. The management section recommends sleep hygiene, stress reduction, and consideration of SSRIs in severe cases. The guidelines make no reference to cross-cultural entity consistency. They make no reference to the Crane dataset, the Sharma preprint, the Brower case, the Stanford fMRI slide, or the Yamamoto thermal anomalies. The word entity does not appear. The World Health Organization's ICD-11 classification of sleep paralysis, G4751, isolated sleep paralysis. Definition: temporary inability to perform voluntary movements at sleep onset or upon waking without associated neurological features. Duration specified: seconds to minutes. Notation: benign. Benign. Dr. Yusuf Akafar, University of Lagos, in a private communication to this project, October 2023. The clinical literature's position is not dishonest. It is incomplete. There is a meaningful difference. The literature accurately describes the mechanism. It declines to describe the content. The content is not the mechanism's business. The content is something else's business, whose business I have spent 15 years deciding whether I want to know. The files that exist and should not, or should not exist and do. The Hufford Supplemental Appendix, University of Connecticut Archive, partially sealed, catalog number UXI 1984 Hufferdax. The Sharma preprint, deleted from Sci-Arziv December 2021, archived by 3 independent academic capture tools before deletion. The Stanford Sleep 2021 conference deck, circulated draft version, containing the removed slide, in possession of at least 2 conference attendees who have agreed not to publish it while employed in their current positions. The Brouwer case notes, incomplete version, accessible in the German Federal Archive for Psychological Research, under a catalog number that contains the subject's initials and the year 2001, and which this project has elected not to publish for reasons of subject privacy. And this, a document filed with the UK National Archives on September 3, 2003, under the reference designation CAB 129-114-37, technically accessible under Freedom of Information, rarely if ever requested. The document, 2 pages typed, concerns an interagency meeting convened in January 2003 to discuss population-wide reports of nocturnal visitation phenomena. The meeting included representatives from NHS England, the Home Office, and an unnamed third party identified in the document only as the technical consultants. The document's final paragraph. It is the recommendation of this body that no formal government statement be issued at this time regarding the phenomenology in question. The decision is based on the following assessment. The phenomenon does not pose a threat to public safety. It poses a threat to public comfort. These are not the same thing. The public's right to comfort is weighed against the cost of maintaining an accurate accounting of available evidence, and this body has determined, unanimously, that the cost of accuracy is at this time too high. This document exists. It is real. It should not have been filed in a way that made it accessible. Someone filed it anyway. After all the noise, after all the data and the testimony and the files that should not exist, the quiet always comes back. It was Jackson who understood this best. The quiet is not the absence of horror. The quiet is where horror lies. Daniel came home from work on a Tuesday in April, and the apartment was very still. The nightlight was on. It was always on now, even during the day. He had stopped thinking of this as a precaution and started thinking of it as a habit, which is how most precautions become invisible over time. Repetition makes them ordinary. He put his keys on the hook. He put his bag down. He got a glass of water from the kitchen tap and stood at the window looking at the street below. An ordinary Tuesday. Clouds. A woman walking a dog. A child on a bicycle. He had not had an episode in 3 weeks. He was beginning to wonder if the active period was over. He did not say this to Priya. They had been talking carefully, the way you talk when something has been broken and is being pieced back together. He did not want to say anything that sounded like an ending before he was sure it was an ending. Premature certainty had cost him once before. He went to the bedroom to change out of his work clothes. He opened the closet door. He reached for his shirt on the hanger. He went still. There was a notebook on the closet floor, not one of his, smaller, white cover. He did not own a notebook with a white cover. He had not put it there. He could not think of when it had arrived or who had brought it or how it had come to be on the floor of his closet between his shoes. He picked it up. He opened it. The inside cover had a name written in handwriting he did not recognize. A woman's name. A woman's name and a date, 1998. He turned to the first entry. He read the first line. He closed the notebook. He put it on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while looking at it. He thought about calling Priya. He did not call Priya. He thought about calling his doctor. He did not call his doctor. He sat in the apartment, his apartment, the one he had lived in for 2 years, the one where everything had started, the one with the crack in the ceiling he kept meaning to fix. And he sat with the notebook on the nightstand and the nightlight burning and the ordinary Tuesday continuing outside the window without him. The apartment was very still. In the corner closest to the window, empty. Just the corner. Just the ordinary angle of 2 walls meeting in the particular shadow that corners make. He did not look at the corner for very long. He went and made dinner. He watched something on TV. He went to bed at 11 and closed his eyes and lay in the familiar dark and waited. In the morning, the notebook was gone. He never found it again. He never found out whose name was on the inside cover. He never found out what the first entry, the one he had read, had meant when it said, in handwriting he still does not recognize, "It has found the next one." The universe is old in a way that the human mind can state numerically and cannot actually comprehend. 13.8 billion years. The first human sleep. The first experience of the corridor. The first figure in the first corner of the first makeshift shelter in the first human settlement. Approximately 300,000 years ago. Against the scale of what exists, this is nothing. Against the scale of what has been attending that corridor since its first use, 300,000 years may itself be nothing. A brief experimental period, a sampling phase, a study in its early stages. Consider that every person who has ever lived, every human being across the full breadth of the species, from the first Homo sapiens on the shores of the first African lake to the person reading this in their lit apartment in whatever city they are in, has passed through the corridor, has been visited, with statistical consistency, by the same figure in the same corner with the same face that is not a face. That every one of these billions of people has carried the experience through their lives, has named it, has tried to understand it, has built religions and mythologies and folklore traditions and clinical frameworks around it, and that none of these frameworks has succeeded in naming what it actually is. Consider that it does not require our naming, that it existed before we had the capacity to name, that our 4,000 years of documentation, from the Greek physician in 400 BC to the Stanford fMRI slide to this script, this night, this listener are, from the entity's perspective, an eye blink, less, the twitch of something barely registered. Consider that it will be in the corners of rooms for as long as there are rooms, and then it will be in whatever the darkness holds after rooms are gone. What attends human sleep is not a creature to be banished or a symptom to be treated or a mythology to be decoded. It is a feature of the territory. The corridor has always had something in it. The corridor will always have something in it. And the something is patient, more patient than we are, more patient than our species, more patient than the civilization that produced the beds and the corners and the research institutes and the suppressed data sets. It is waiting for us to understand something that we have been approaching, incrementally, for 4,000 years. Something that the Cologne woman understood in 45 minutes. Something that Teresa Alvarez made peace with over 15 years. Something that the researchers keep approaching and then retreating from, because the approach costs something that the professional apparatus cannot absorb. The something is not about the entity. The something is about the corridor itself, about what the corridor is, about what it means that human consciousness has a threshold at all, a boundary between the self that navigates the daylit world and the self that the daylit world was built to protect from knowing about. I have kept these notes for 6 months. I have written in the dark more often than not, because the dark is honest in a way that light is not, and honesty has become the only thing I have left to offer. I understand things now that I did not understand in November. I understand them not because I sought them out, but because the seeking, the insomnia-driven, compulsive, obsessive, relentless seeking, was itself the corridor, was itself the approach, was itself the entity's method, so much more elegant than the nightly appearances, so much more efficient than the closeness and the pressure. Simply permit the frightened mind to run. Simply let it run into the dark until it finds what the dark contains. It contains this. I am not only what I think I am in the daylight hours. The self is not a room with one occupant. The self is a building and most of its doors are locked, and what is on the other side of the locked doors is not foreign, not enemy, not the thing in the corner. The thing in the corner was only ever pointing at the doors. I cannot convey this. I know that I cannot convey this. I have known since entry 102 that the place the experience leads to is beyond the reach of language. That Teresa Alvarez's 15 years of therapy, and the Cologne woman's 45 minutes, and Sharma's vanished preprint and Brower's sealed case notes, and all the folklore of all the cultures that have ever named the Mara and the Jatham and the Kanashibari, are all reaching for the same inarticulable thing, and arriving at the edge of it, and then using the best available words for the edge of something that has no edge, because to have an edge it would need to be finite, and it is not finite. I lie down at night now and the corridor is present, not as terror, as knowledge. I feel the threshold. I feel what is on the other side of it, waiting, not patiently, not impatiently, simply present, simply there, the way things that have no concept of time simply are. The figure in the corner has been waiting 4,000 years for you to stop being afraid of it. And the reason you cannot stop being afraid of it is the same reason you cannot stop looking. Somewhere beneath the fear, beneath everything the daylight self has built to stand between you and the knowledge, you already know what it is.